There are at least 40 second language acquisition theories and theorists, and as many teaching approaches that emerged from them. SLA theories draw from many disciplines, including psychology, linguistics, sociology, and neuroscience. We will start with an historical overview of some of the most popular theories and approaches to SLA. In this video, you will hear about and consider the main theories and theorists from the 1950s and 60s through to the present day, and we will briefly mention approaches attached to each of these theories. During the virtual sessions, we will discuss in more depth some of the key enduring teaching approaches that emerged from the theories. This would be a good time to print out the SLA Principles and Theories chart provided in your Blackboard course. It contains more information than what is covered in this presentation, and it will be a handy tool to reference as we make our way through. We will begin our discussion with a look at one of the oldest theories, the grammar translation method. One of the earliest methods used to teach English was called the grammar translation method. With the grammar translation method, early English language teachers attempted to teach using the same approach that was used to teach foreign languages like Greek and Latin. Students primarily translated texts and attempted to learn about grammar or language in this way. Very little focus was put on oral communication in the target language. Think of how Latin was and is taught. Perhaps some of you are old enough to have been taught French or German in this way, conjugating verbs, translating reading passages, and filling out worksheets. With the grammar translation method, the rules and vocabulary of the language are taught apart from any actual communicative activity. The class is teacher-fronted, as the teacher usually provides a lot of the information and does most of the talking. As a student, you follow a pattern and typically fill in worksheets and study translated vocabulary lists to show your understanding. This structure-based approach focuses mainly on teaching students about the language, but not necessarily on how to use the language to communicate. Take a moment to consider this structure-based approach. Do you use any of these grammar translation activities in your classroom? For example, do you teach grammar rules, utilize vocabulary lists or worksheets? Of course you do. Is your class sometimes teacher-fronted, more speaking and direction from the teacher than the students? No doubt. Are some of these techniques problematic or outdated? Sure they are. But are they useful? Absolutely. None of these individual approaches from the grammar translation method used in SLA is, in and of itself, a bad thing. Many of these techniques and approaches have their place in the classroom. For example, knowing some rules is helpful. Authentic, targeted, student-generated vocabulary lists may well assist in student learning. Teaching grammar when appropriate as it comes up within a contextualized, theme-based lesson, or to help with accuracy of speech or when self-editing written work is very important. If this is not the only method being used, some of the aspects from this method, as we've just pointed out, can serve a purpose. They help language learners to know that there are grammatical rules and how to apply them, for example. This ability, known as language awareness, can help language learners speak and write with more accuracy. The theory of behaviorism in SLA looks at language, as the name implies, as a behavior to be learned. Behaviorists believe that adults can learn language in the same way that children learn. Behaviorists are also sometimes referred to as structural linguists because they also believe, as did grammar translationists, that learning or memorizing the structural patterns in sentences will support language development. The direct method and the audiolingual approach to language teaching have been developed from behaviorist ideas. Let's take a closer look at these two practices. The direct method focuses on the oral production of the language and also introduced the notion of only utilizing the target language during instruction. Other later characteristics include teaching concepts of vocabulary through pantomiming, utilizing real-life objects and other visual materials, and teaching grammar through an inductive approach. This means having students discover grammar rules through the presentation of sufficient linguistic forms and examples in the target or English language. The audiolingual approach stresses habit formation through listening, memorizing, and repeating language. Early teachers of this approach relied heavily on grammar drills. Using this approach, the teacher presents a model of a correct sentence, and then the student repeats and memorizes that properly formed sentence without necessarily understanding the meaning. The belief of the early behaviorist theorists was that humans could be trained to learn language through reinforcement. Correct usage received positive reinforcement, and incorrect usage received negative feedback. The audiolingual method was also called the Army method, as it was how Americans were taught foreign languages for service. The Pimsleur method is one example of this approach, and the Berlitz method, which you might be familiar with, combines both the direct and the audiolingual approach. Neither the direct method nor the audiolingual approach is ideal to encourage communicative competence, but minimally, with these approaches, a language learner is able to practice speaking the language. Neither approach puts heavy emphasis on reading or writing, although in later years the Berlitz Company, for example, began to include reading and writing in its series. With the audiolingual approach, you might say to yourself, this seems like an old-fashioned or outdated approach to instruction. Does the audiolingual approach have a place in today's classroom? Is it still useful? Yes. Some examples of appropriate use of ALA include reciting a script to aid in fluency, encouraging some memorization of vocabulary, especially student-centered, authentic, and theme-based vocabulary, choral repetition for speaking, and pronunciation practice. This is a good exercise for students not comfortable with speaking. What are your thoughts on these methods? Have you considered them in the past? Do you make use of them now? When and how do you use them? How and why might choral repetition or choral drills be beneficial in the classroom? Think about these questions and make some notes. This will come up again later on. Contrasting with and in response to behaviorist theories, cognitivist theorists view language not as a behavior to be learned, but as an innate ability to be developed through cognitive thought processes. The language learner is viewed much more as a thinker and a processor of information. Scientist and linguist Noam Chomsky was a leader in the field of cognitivism and one of the first to describe language learning in a more complex and creative way than as simply a behavior to be learned. His belief is that the human brain is primed to create and use language. The naturalist approach to language teaching emerged from this thinking with the idea that learners do not need to be taught the components of language, grammar, vocabulary, etc. separately, as much as they require a low-stress environment providing comprehensible input to allow the learner to naturally acquire language. While Chomsky focused mostly on first language acquisition, Stephen Krashen, another cognitive linguist, built on Chomsky's work to develop his ideas about second language acquisition. Krashen emphasized the importance of rich language input for second language acquisition, and another cognitivist thinker, Merrill Swain, raised the importance of the language learner's language production or output. We'll get more deeply into Krashen and Swain and language input and output in our virtual sessions. Constructivists built on the viewpoints of cognitivism, but stressed that interaction in the language acquisition process is key. Students must engage and use the language in genuine communicative situations in order to really learn or acquire it. By engaging authentically together, students learn how to construct the meaning of words and concepts through assimilating prior knowledge and new information to gain new understanding. Linguist Michael Long is notable for his contribution of the interaction hypothesis, a theory of SLA which places importance on face-to-face interaction. Communicative language teaching emerged from these combined theories with the ultimate goal for students described as communicative competence. Communicative language teaching focuses on meaningful communication and usage of language over the structure of the language. A CLT syllabus is functional rather than structural in development. Students are given authentic interactive tasks that allow them to work together to discover, use, and produce new language. The class is therefore more student-centered than teacher-centered. The teacher is a facilitator and observer rather than a participant or director of the learning activities. Brown, in 2007, defined CLT as an approach to language teaching methodology that emphasizes authenticity, interaction, student-centered learning, task-based activities, and communication for real-world meaningful purposes. Major criticisms of CLT have included that with the focus on fluency and less emphasis on error correction, accuracy sometimes lags. The advantages of CLT are many. It is a holistic approach that grows out of the interests and needs of the learners. This, along with task-based communicative activities, creates liveliness and motivation in the classroom. In Virtual Session A, we will look in depth at key enduring principles that have emerged from the many years of combined SLA research and practice, with particular focus on principles and practices that emerged from the communicative language teaching approach. Sociocultural theorists contributed to the idea that interaction plays a key role in learning. While not specific to language learning, socioculturalists were deeply influential in the early years of developing SLA theories and approaches, and their contributions continue to impact language teaching today. Sociocultural theorists posit that people learn within their zone of proximal development. The concepts or skills just beyond their current level of understanding. Through interactions with teachers or more experienced peers who model and provide support for more complex language and thinking. This is similar thinking to cognitive naturalist Stephen Krashen's I+1 theory, where students are provided with information that they already know, plus information or language one step above that, in a relaxed, natural environment to help them acquire language. We will talk more about Krashen and stages of language learning later on in our course. In addition, sociocultural concepts include collaborative learning, discourse analysis, which includes analyzing language beyond the sentence level, holistic approaches to language education, looking at language as a whole, not dividing it into parts, such as only looking at grammar or only looking at structure or function, and the understanding that language is mediated through and deeply informed by its cultural contexts. All of these concepts come from sociocultural thinkers. And finally, we look briefly at developments and recent findings in the field of neuroscience. Neuroscience, which looks at the brain and its impact on behavior and cognitive functions, support many SLA theories, including some that may have been considered old-fashioned or outdated. For example, behaviorist practices such as recall drills and quizzes have been proven effective for developing long-term memory in learning. Also, we now have evidence that when students do the cognitive work of retrieving and generating authentic, meaning-focused language, rather than repeating controlled stimulus response routines, they are more likely to develop long-term memory. Similarly, the behaviorists' focus on repetitive practice has been validated, but we now recognize that varied repetitive practice, or cycling back, using a range of modalities addressing all language skills, for example, speaking and then writing the new language, results in more robust and transferable long-term memory. Recent brain research also supports the constructivist values of productive struggle, pattern seeking, and information organizing by the learner. Studies show that when learners are given the opportunity to make sense of new material that builds off of their prior knowledge and experience, they are in fact strengthening and adding to their neural network, the basis of memory and learning. These findings reinforce the practice first heralded in communicative language teaching and other earlier approaches, and emphasizes the importance of teachers utilizing a strategic mix of key features when planning instruction. We will end this introduction to theories and approaches with a reminder that today ESOL practitioners draw from a rich and varied body of SLA research and evidence-based practices to inform their thinking, planning, and teaching. And by restating that although there isn't one single theory that explains everything about second language acquisition, there is research-based consensus that points to the importance of authentic, meaningful interaction in the acquisition of language. We see these characteristics most in communicative approaches. Please think about and make notes on any final thoughts or questions you have on these main research theories. We will begin Virtual Session A with time to address any of these remaining questions or thoughts. For example, consider which of these theories or theorists speak to you. Which might you like more information on? And how might this theoretical information impact your practice? In the upcoming sessions, we will be discussing more about communicative approaches and principles, including comprehensible input and output, the affective filter, and learning versus acquisition. Thank you so much.